After several months of absence, I hope you enjoyed the ride because I want to take on every single episode of this epic battle against a memorable villain. So here we are again. I know it's been almost half a year since I uploaded my last video on YouTube. The thing is, a lot of things changed on August, so I only have the afternoons available to provide new content. I also opened a channel on Twitch so that I can upload AMVs without any limitation. But I'm pretty sure you're not here to hear my problems, but to see more animation content. And that's what we're going to do today, since we're taking on the Otherworld mini-arc, which kinda represents a passage between the Cell arc and the Boo arc. And of course, we're going to find out if it does still hold up animation-wise. So without further ado, let's start with what we left off. I'm DB Animators and sorry for the delay. Before we jump in the actual episodes, a little background. Much like the Garlic Jr. arc being almost entirely written by Katsuyuki Sumizawa, Aya Matsui is the main responsible for the script of this mini-arc. She was also the series composer of GT, of the Path of Power movie, of a few Dr. Slump movies, and is currently one of the writers of Pokémon Sun and Moon. If we take a closer look at the staff list of these 5 episodes, we'll notice a few big absentees. For instance, none of these episodes is supervised by Masahiro Shimanuki, who at that time was probably busy on the Plan to Eradicate Science OVA production, providing both supervision and key animation. This aforesaid special is directed by another regular, Shigeyasu Yamauchi, who doesn't provide any sort of direction here likewise. And as far as direction goes, Yoshihiro Ueda is another big absentee, since his most recent work was a direction of the Bojack movie, which was released before episode 195. This aspect definitely explains why 185 is the last episode from the Shala Head Shala era to be directed by Ueda, and also supervised by Tadayoshi Yamamuro, the new movie supervisor after Minoru Maeda's departure. On a narrative standpoint, I quite like the idea of a halfway story before the umpteenth timeskip, because it makes the passage between two main arcs far less abrupt, thus flowing slightly more naturally. That's actually an advantage for the anime, since sometimes Toriyama's manga was so fast-paced that there was barely no room for different kinds of story, so I do believe this is another reason for fillers to exist. I never cared about something being canon. I actually do care for how they are executed. However, I'd lie if I said I wouldn't approve some more slice-of-life fillers, much like Super did between an arc and the other. But still. Anyway, let's jump in the actual episodes to find out if they still hold up. Episode 195 marks the start of this mini-arc. It's supervised by Keisuke Masunaga and Studio Cockpit, an across-the-board fan favorite for being the most complete and consistent studio after Segasha as far as animation goes. Masunaga's approach is so well defined, you never miss its distinctive ears and his expressions are pretty nice. His art is so likable, no wonder he would be chosen to create the character design for Super Saiyan 3 Gotenks in the Boo arc. As always, his corrections dominate other animator stuff, including Chikako Uesugi and Kuniko Iwagami's work, former Studio Junio animators. Nonetheless, the first half is pretty different from any cockpit material we've seen so far, since it's not that Sakuga-packed. In actuality, the real protagonist of this half is the episode director Mitsuo Hashimoto, whose output on the series has globally been positive, albeit with some nice prompts once in a while. When the action is not the main focus, it's important to rely on a good direction, especially when you get tons of dialogues. Having Hashimoto's distinctive glass reflection being used here is a nice touch. The highlight of this half is clearly the bit with Kaio-sama introducing Laikaio, an Antelitteram Monaka in which we get a well-executed background animation from an unknown animator and the main quirk of Hashimoto's direction, the use of creative transitions, with the Serpentine Road atmosphere becoming a spear on the finger of a blue-colored Daikaio. Also later on, during Goku and Kaio's journey, we get an interesting framing from the plane standpoint and another display of a well-executed storyboard from Hashimoto. There is a nice contrast between the pink sky and the polychromatic atmosphere of the Otherworld. Moving on to the second half, we meet West Kaio and his best pupil Paikuhan. The former immediately starts a fight against North Kaio, which seems to be animated by Hitoshi Ehara, one of the key animators under Yamamura's staff in the Cell arc. Of course, big props to Twitter user ThatWorg for finding the Paikuhan Genga with its layout, since without it I could have never found out who made this bit, strongly corrected by Masunaga. And speaking of Masunaga, he maybe handles Daikaio's big entrance. Goku and Kaio's expressions are amazing. That impact frame looks really cool and reaction shots are indeed great, but there might be a chance he only provided corrections in this cut. The very next bit of Daikaio's very awkward dancing is probably made by the same animator. Even if it's done for comic purpose, it's another pretty well executed bit. The best part is that twirl before he puts his radio on the ground. The tournament hasn't begun yet, but Cockpit Sentries feel so full of life. It eventually turns out Cell is back, as he's willing to spread terror in hell. And here we get to the worst part of this episode, and Masama sending Cell to hell. It doesn't look too bad per se, but the repetition of the same scene of Cell falling down is incredibly annoying and time-worn. This device felt so contrived in the original series most of the time. I failed to see the point of emphasizing the same scene more than once instead of moving forward. Story-wise, I'm not a particular fan of this episode section either. While it's cool to see Masunaga's freezer, I just cannot fathom the point of bringing Cell once again after over 40 episodes with him as the main villain. And confidentially not even a good villain, but still. Goku transforms into Super Saiyan Black, which was originally a regular Super Saiyan, and easily defeats the Ginyu Force minus Ginyu. Once again, Masunaga's best aspect is character's expressivity. Even if movements aren't particularly complex, their physical pain is so well described through exaggerated expressions. I simply cannot fathom how the anime screwed up Goku's hair color. In his Gengas and even in the episode preview, he's shown as a Super Saiyan. His aura is yellow and his eyelines are closed. How could I miss those details? Anyway, Masunaga is likely responsible for the very next scene too, with Paikuhan attacking Cell in a fiery aura, causing an endless amount of impact frames and sending the android into a pond of red water. Once again, my favorite part is the rough expressions, as Paikuhan's attacks are so strong they make the villain's pupils literally disappear. Lastly, he uses his Hyper Tornado to throw Cell and the Ginyu Force minus Ginyu into a mountain of needles, displaying some neat liquid effects and another clever transition from Hashimoto, with the villains getting locked in the Hell's Prison. Overall, this episode is really good, definitely a strong start for this mini-arc. Moving forward with 196, it's time for the Other World tournament to begin at long last. This second episode is supervised by Yuji Akamada and Studio Carpenter, one of the series regular from the Cell games onwards, who also worked on a few episodes of Super, often providing corrections. His art style didn't suffer particular changes, with those round ears, thick eyebrows and soft jaws on the front line. But I got to say, I don't really care for Akamada's art during this era. I always found it pretty uninteresting and kinda middle of the road. It's not as wacky as Masunaga or as appealing as Buark Yamamuro. Not bad, not great, it's just in the middle. On one hand, the episode looks rather consistent, but at the same time looks kinda bland. The first half is basically a setup for the tournament, and as a result it's very dialogue focused, and the only bit of action is represented by the race between Goku and East Kaiosama. Nothing much to say about it, it's fairly well executed and I quite like the impact frame caused by South Kaio's starter handgun. Judging from the shape of Goku's ears and jaw, I suggest it's animated by Akamada himself. As for its storyboard and direction, Kazuhito Kikuchi is in line with his usual output in the series, which is fairly decent with some peaks once in a while. He is quite capable of giving a true sense of depth by putting objects or characters into different layers, and likes to combine different colors to create some nice looking background contrasts. Nonetheless, the most unique quirk of this episode is located upon the music department, since this is the first and only episode of this era to make frequent use of soundtrack from the original Dragon Ball and its earliest movies. It feels extremely uncommon for this era, in which there is a prevalence of tracks from movies 6, 7, 8, and it actually works! It's a quite strong callback to the past. I wonder where Kikuchi got his idea from, since he only joined the series in the Namek arc. Either that or just to match the light heart and lack of seriousness of this portion of the tournament. The first showdown involves Olibu against a dwarf from the East Galaxy, which is animated by a very familiar name, Jin Inaba, who younger viewers may know for his work on Super, and of course his rotation guy epithet despite never being confirmed yet. It's a pretty conservative cut, and his timing and speed lines terribly resemble Inaba's very first work on the show, that is 17 killing off Vegeta in 164. We learn so many things about him just by looking at his uncorrected Gengas, and apparently Akamada's corrections are only partial, as we can trace his angular ears on Olibu just fine. The following section is simply a montage of a few fights, which isn't particularly great in terms of both animation and direction. The same goes with Goku's battle against Caterpie, which mostly involves comedy around the ladder tickling Goku. Again, I'm not a big fan of its execution. While I do get their purpose, I find it very shallow. The aftermath of Caterpie crying and turning to a chrysalis seems to be handled by Akemi Seiki, another one of Yamamuro's regular animators of the Cell arc. I quite like how her art is detached by Akamada's approach and is actually closer to Movie 8 Yamamuro. It's a fairly welcome addition to an okay episode. It's pretty clear I prefer 195 more. It's pretty slow at parts, fights are all but memorable, but again, it's alright and the tournament has just begun. Nevertheless, 197 doesn't appear to be that promising. In terms of the actual stuff, it's possibly the weakest episode of this arc. Don't get me wrong, I'm the first one to admit my predilection for Last House entries from the Saiyan and Namek arcs, thanks to pure talents like Ohara, Shida and Saiki, and to Uchiyama's corrections not being that invasive. It's just that at this point of the series, Uchiyama's corrections are not that pleasing, but are still pretty much tolerable at the very least. They don't overwhelm Taichiro Ohara's content completely, but surely change some of his traits, such as his ears getting flattened or the distance between the eyes being reduced. Still, Ohara's characters do look nice. His Goku looks so simple, but as you know, simplicity is the answer sometimes. His trademark smoke and sweat are simply hard to miss. The fight between Tolby and Tapika isn't that great, but Ohara's timing and poses are quite nice, and again, having him deal with a sweaty character is an appropriate pick. He also animates a large portion of the following battle, which is again not very good. In this case, while some strategy might be involved, its choreography remains pretty stale, though I do praise the way Ohara draws Maraiko. His traits definitely make him quite monstrous, and those dashes on his eyebrows are so familiar. Likewise, his shading works so well on him, and his expressions are incredible. However, the quality drops drastically as soon as Uchiyama takes over to handle Maraiko throwing Furog out of bounds. You can totally see the difference between him and Ohara, his huge lack of superficial shading around his body, and the overall flatness of Goku's reaction shot. The overall pacing is much slower too. Sadly, it's all downhill from here as Uchiyama also takes on the entire fight between Goku and Aqua. And guess what? It's not very good. I mean, having an underwater battle is a decent idea, but again, the execution leaves to be desired. Uchiyama's Goku may look fine, maybe because his character doesn't need too many details, but due to his simplistic approach, his expressions tend to appear as flat as a pancake. You can tell he tried to give a demonic look to Aqua, but his art is too two-dimensional for it to work. As for his key animation, not the best, not the worst. Mediocre at most. To his credit though, the choreography wasn't even that great to begin with. Daisuke Nishio isn't known for being the most creative director, especially at this precise point of the series, but his entries usually display some nice fighting moves, like his Goku vs Cell in 179 or Piccolo vs 17 in 149. So it's really unfortunate to witness such poorly executed fights. Even if strategies are indeed involved, not all of them manage to produce an interesting outcome, and the majority of the battle seen here is, again, in the middle. Surprisingly, the last showdown between Golibu and Paikuhan starts off kinda decently, with Paikuhan throwing a ki at Olibu and dashing towards him, with the latter countering. If we exclude the really poor reaction shots of the noseless audience, this section is actually not that bad. Uchiyama's impact frames look pretty nifty, and Bakuhan flying doesn't look that choppy. Sadly, these are the only praiseworthy aspects I can think of, because to be fair, if there is one honest reason for this to be considered enjoyable, that's thanks to Hidenori Arai's sound effects. No need to explain why, they sound so classic. They seem to improve any battle, even the worst animated one. Why do I say this? Because I think this fight is not better than those from the Battle of Gods arc of Dragon Ball Super, and my opinion towards that arc isn't that positive either. After the explosion of Olympus Ki Blast, Uchiyama animates a poorly choreographed exchange of punches and kicks, with both fighters using instantaneous movements over and over. This part is awful. Nishio's board is a considerable downside of this episode. His framings look stuck, the choreographies are boring, and I quite dislike the invisible shockwave device. Likewise, Uchiyama's movements feel so slow and rigid, and his attacks are just weightless. Furthermore, the follow-up isn't much better. After both Olibo and Baikuhan scream at each other, Ohara takes over and animates the very conservative sequence of punches and kicks until the end of their battle. His poses may look fine, but they simply keep on going all the time. No matter how good it will look, if a certain cut is reused so many times, it eventually gets very frustrating to watch. This fight is no exception. And it angers me so much, because I wanted to witness a much better fight between two skilled warriors. Simply remove Arai's sound effects and you'll get a really terrible fight. One of the single worst of the franchise, not because it's a Last House territory, not because of that, since I'm a fan of Ohara's usual output, but because of the boring, repetitive and underwhelming structure of the fight. And you know what else? This is not even Last House post-Androids arc worst material, because some of Ohara's drawings look pretty nice. Uchiyama thankfully didn't get to correct Dai Kaiosama's ears, and I'm just crazy about mouth shading in general. Nevertheless, this is clearly the worst episode of this arc. Ohara's really talented, but every single battle of this entry is really dull. I really hope the next one will be better. Okay, never mind. 198 is supervised by Bizawa, who isn't a very popular name among fans for reasons I don't need to enumerate by now. Although, to his credit, it seems like his Cell arc entries are better or maybe less bad than they were in the past. At least art-wise, mostly thanks to Toshiyuki Kanno, who is safely the best artist and animator of Studio Live. I mean, finding the differences between him and the Bizawa is extremely simple. However, Kanno is completely absent in this episode, possibly due to him working in Movie 9. It starts off with a close-up of a rather solid-looking Goku, probably drawn by Hideki Inoue, who joined Studio Live in 148 alongside Yoko Inoue in order to replace Tomoya Ida's departure. Inoue's art style isn't confirmed yet, but apparently is quite inspired by Kanno's approach, judging from his facial shapes and ears. As soon as the battle between Goku and Maraiko begins, we immediately catch sight of Osamu Kazai's directional peaks, starting with a really weird technique of Goku's soul being separated from his body, which I honestly don't get. It kinda resembles the interactions between Yugi and the Pharaoh, with one of them appearing as a floating spirit. Then, after a 16:9 aspect ratio of the next framing, the battle begins with a decent pacing, which is right away ruined by the very outdated punching the camera device. I'm not quite certain about who animated this cut, but Bizawa's hand is all over it, especially on Goku's pouting lips. Though, unlike the previous episode, this battle at least takes advantage of the otherworld environment, like using the asteroids on the sky as a weapon or even as a launch pad. That aside, it's not something I'd willingly rewatch again. Of course, this is where Ebizawa's key animation takes over, which is what you would expect from an average Ebizawa material. Formulaic gestures, formulaic poses, and formulaic expressions. It's not wrong to animate in a predictable way, but it always depends on the overall quality of one's predictable animation. In Ebizawa's case, it's formulaic in a quite dull way. I always find his key animation a copy and paste of his previous work. There is nothing new or interesting about him animation-wise. The rest of the first half mainly focuses on North and West Kaiosama, gambling on who is going to win the final round between Goku and Baikuhan. Nothing much to say here, the artwork looks okay, the storyboarding isn't that interesting to deserve a comment, so let's dive into the main event. After a reuse of Inoue's Goku and of a random guy waving the other world planet flag, the final match between Goku and Paikuhan begins, and this early section is in line with the content of the tournament we've seen so far. Ebizawa starts off with a bunch of stills with Arai sound effects on, and of course with the stock and rudimentary gestures and poses. Kazai's board is kinda stale too, with the overuse of 90esque multicolored backgrounds, which sadly don't manage to improve its content. As soon as Paikuhan punches Goku's face, we get a pretty unnecessary slow-mo and another unnatural and stiff reaction shot from Goku, leading to Paikuhan launching a ki blast at him, with Goku dodging and starting his counter. If there is one slight positive about Ebizawa's output, it might be his Goku, who doesn't look as ugly as his other characters like Vegeta or Bulma, but as a whole, I just don't really care for this segment. It's actually been really hard for me to analyze these recent episodes because I'm aware of mostly giving negative opinions. And believe me, it's not my intention to sound negative towards the franchise, but at the same time, I simply cannot wink at it and pretend I enjoy what I'm watching. And while the device of the two warriors being chased by their respective energy waves might be mildly interesting, I'm just disappointed by its execution. Ebizawa's stiff poses and timing certainly don't elevate the action quality. After the two beams collide, the two fighters descend and start a power struggle, which again isn't that engaging as far as the action goes. It is likely animated by Hideki Inoue, whose callbacks to Kanno's approach pop up once more, not only in Goku's art but also on West Kaio's twitching, which almost confused me. For a second, I actually thought Kanno provided uncredited key animation during this part. That aside, I honestly have nothing much to add, as this is only a prelude to the real battle. Near the end, Paikuhan takes off his weighty clothing, while Goku transforms into a Super Saiyan. About this latter bit, two things called forth my attention: the sparks around the Super Saiyan aura, which we usually spot in the Super Saiyan 2 state, and the presence of a yellow lock of hair on Goku's forehead. Again, something rare which we only see in his base form, as it tends to disappear in the Super Saiyan form. The episode itself is pretty dull, much like the previous one, but then again we can view it as a taste for what's to come. That is the very last episode of this mini-arc, as well as the last episode of the Chala Head Chala era. Episode 199, the arc finale and easily the best episode by miles. After a parade of weak entries and forgettable battles, it feels so refreshing to deal with some great material, all the more so thanks to a pretty strong staff list. I guess this can be considered a semi-all-star episode due to the presence of several big names of the Dragon Ball animation industry. Starting with the supervisor Naoki Miyahara in his second time in this role after episode 159, whose corrections as always overwhelm every other key animator's work. Even just by looking at the beginning scene, we know its content will be great, thanks to a fairly strong atmosphere provided by Hiroki Shibata's direction. Shibata joined the series in 170 before the Cell games, and his directional output has been quite remarkable. This is the final battle, so it makes sense for it to have thunderbolts lighting up the entire battlefield in order to give the already mentioned true atmosphere. Shibata's output also works on less serious moments, like when North Kaio reminds West Kaio of their bet and literally feels big and confident of his own pupil winning. On to the animation department, this early section is animated by Akira Inagami, who is responsible for several iconic moments of the franchise, like Future Trunks' transformation or Broly's legendary Super Saiyan appearance in the movie. All of these moments, including this one, are pulled by Nagami's main feature, which is his distinctive and unique way to animate auras. In fact, my favorite aspect about him is his visual effects, which really caught my attention. He animates Goku's Kamehameha, which Paikuhan dodges, producing his trademark blobby smoke, which leads to Goku constantly firing ki blasts at his opponent with an infinite amount of impact frames. The execution of this scene is very satisfying, with Inagami taking advantage of Shibata's compelling use of lights. And Goku's final ki waves crossing in the impact is a pretty cool touch. After another showcase of Shibata's remarkable sense of scale, it's time for Paikuhan to take the offensive as he spins around to create a hyper tornado which devastates the entire arena. This bit is animated by Hiroyuki Yokota, who is someone I'm still not that familiar with, and I got to know only thanks to his Gengas and Raw layouts. Yokota's art is heavily corrected by Miyahara, but his wind effects seem like his own. I'm not going to lie, but this is probably my least favorite part of this episode, which isn't that interesting and feels a bit long. This sequence ends with Goku repelling the tornado, after which Tetsuya Saiki takes over and animates Goku using his Kaioken powered Super Saiyan to punch Paikuhan literally to the moon with another neat impact frame. His aura animation and action lines are so distinctive, and those hand poses and timing strongly resemble Shida's usual output. The animation assignment of this segment is pretty strange though, as Goku charging a Kamehameha doesn't appear to be made by Saiki, but the impact of Goku's tumble is clearly his work, judging from its corresponding impact frame, which looks identical to his work in episode 92. On the other hand, the subsequent beam struggle is definitely Saiki's cut, who animates a pretty crisp and gleaming energy wave, which again is nothing new from him, but Paikuhan endures Goku's attack as he delivers one powerful kick with another neat impact frame and clever use of smears. Although the very next scene strongly recalls Kazuya Izada, with Paikuhan preparing to kick Goku out of bounds and the latter dodging in extremis. This bit is so well executed, from Paikuhan's feet becoming smears between action lines to his dynamic and loose pose while preparing to defeat his opponent. Izada elevates Shibata's choreography in a whole new level. The way he animates his roundhouse kick is such a rare finesse, and it's great to see it culminate in another stylish spin after Goku evades the attack. It would be shocking if it turned out not to be his work. Moving forward to the end of this strong half, Paikuhan strikes different poses in slow-mo, puts his fist in front of his face, and after a 360 degrees rotation, he prepares his finishing technique, his Thunder Flash. The addition of white lights and blue sparks before the impact is a pretty cool touch, and the fiery effect manages to be rather effective as well. After the commercial break, the second half begins with a bang, because my favorite animator Naoto Shishida handles the reaction shot of Goku getting engulfed by those flames. Once again, the texture of his visual effects is so simple yet so effective. His white palms pop up immediately during Goku's initial reaction, and it's always great to come across Shida's uncorrected art in his in-betweens and in wide shots. Although his close-ups are heavily corrected, which is a shame to be fair. He also handles the reactions of the audience, including Kaio's, and good to know, all of them are not corrected. The peculiarity of his details is unbelievable. From West Kaio's cute little hands to Daikaio's cigarette turning to ashes between his fingers, and needless to say his trademark fluffy smoke coming out from his mouth. I'm a massive fan of modern Shida, but I'd be lying if I said I wouldn't approve his take-out lines to come back. Next up is another wonderful close-up of Goku fearing another Thunder Flash, as he literally becomes blue with the background turning black. Once again, it's another effective attempt from Shibata to bring up some more tension to the moment, which culminates in the Thunder Flash bank from before, and to Shida providing some background animation while Goku is trying to defend himself. Short yet well executed cut with another showcase of his anatomy knowledge. The way he draws muscles is flawless. Izada comes back again to animate Paikuhan's Ki Blast on Goku, which evades with his teleportation. Once more, the way Paikuhan's leg stretches while leaping looks so exaggerated, and a simple action like throwing an energy blast is executed in a more complex manner. Moving forward, West Kaio is mad at Paikuhan for his negligence, and his anger is entirely reflected by his own eyeglass. But there isn't a moment to breathe as the fight continues, with Goku and Paikuhan firing energy waves at each other, colliding in a multicolored explosion which sends both flying. I'm actually not that sure about who animated this bit, but I'm definitely sure of Shibata's effective output, with the battle being easily visible through Daikaio's sunglasses a la Ryota Nakamura, and the way it transitions to the main event feels so natural and smooth. Naoki Miyahara himself takes over the close-range combat between the two fighters, which is another pretty competent scene. The general timing, those dynamic poses and black and white impact frames are utterly part of his output, but much like Inagami, the most noteworthy aspect about him is his beam effects, as he animates what's a pretty nice looking and crisp Kamehameha, which Paikuhan deflects with ease. This is an aspect we witness so many times in his work in films. On the flip side though, I'm not a big fan of his massive noses, which would eventually get even more disproportionate in the Buu arc, so I guess he's still tolerable at this point. Then Paikuhan elbows Goku and Yoichi Honishi takes over as he handles Goku's ball on the battleground. Oddly enough, even though Miyahara redrew Onishi's facial features, his ears and thin eyebrows are free from any correction procedure. Speaking of the scene itself, it's a case of reused animation used quite correctly, as it's embodied in Shibata's board through Goku's pupil reflection being used back and forth, and as a result Goku teleports behind Paikuhan and fires a super Kamehameha at him, thus ending their combat. Then we get more of Saiki animating the aftermath of their battle, with also a slice of character acting from a victorious Kaiosama. Much like before, his art is overwhelmed by corrections, but I'm glad his hand wasn't redrawn. Lastly, another big name handles the final moments, with Daikaio calling off Goku's victory, much to North Kaio's disappointment. It's 100% Takeo Ide, a veteran who needs no introduction by now. Albeit partially corrected, his idiosyncratic traits like the angular ears, the sharp shading of this era, and unique expressions stand out marvelously. And thus the tournament arc ends, and through a pretty clever transition, 7 years pass and Gohan is now a scholar, ready to start high school. But this is a story we'll tell another day. As for the arc finale, it's a great episode, well directed, well animated, not mind-blowing but still strong enough to be considered the best of this mini-arc. Which sadly did not manage to respect my expectations. Is it better than any of the Tenkaichi Budokai arcs from Dragon Ball? Absolutely not. Is it better than the Tournament of Power? By no means. It's probably the least compelling tournament arc of the franchise. I only enjoyed 2 out of 5 episodes, with one of them being a mere prelude. The middle portion is in the middle. The majority of the battles is boring, is not properly choreographed, and again I feel a bit awkward while giving more criticism than praise. So yeah, if you enjoy it, it's nothing wrong. It's just my opinion. Maybe because I'm pretty hard to please, I'm pretty demanding, I know. Nevertheless, I hope this video didn't bore you. I know I've not been posting anything for 5 months, but due to my morning job, I don't have much spare time and sleep most of all. I hope you like this comeback. In more or less a week the new movie is to be released, and I'm just so enthusiastic about watching what's easily the best animated Dragon Ball piece of media. As usual, remember to follow me on Twitter and on Twitch, where I upload new AMVs every week. Thank you for waiting, and I hope to catch you soon. Ciao.
Hello darkness, my old friend.